What's up, everybody? Today I am here to do my August reading wrap-up. I read a total of 19 books this month, not including one DNF, which I will be talking about first. As you guys might know, I don't DNF books very often, and I really don't like to. When I start reading a book, I intend to finish it to be able to give, like, an opinion or a judgment on it. I don't feel like it's fair to judge a book based on the first 50 or 100 pages or however far I get into it. But occasionally, I will start a book and I just can't get into it at all. And I don't want to force myself to keep reading it, because if I do, I feel like I might end up falling into a reading slump. And that is the case with this book here. And that is Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. And this is one I'm very disappointed to have DNF'd, because generally, I really like reading classics. This is something I read quite a bit outside of like middle grade and YA and horror books. This is like one of my favorite genres to read. I love exploring all of these old classic books that I haven't read yet. And I end up liking a lot of them. Not all of them, of course, are great. I've read a few that were not so good, but yeah, I was excited to check this one out. I had heard a lot of good things about it. I've heard that this is like an old gothic like romance novel with like some spooky supernatural elements to it. And I was excited to check this out. I had never read anything by any of the Bronte sisters before. And unfortunately, I just could not get into this whatsoever. I think I made it like 70 pages in, and it was just so boring. Pretty much all that was happening within those first 70 pages is this family just arguing and fighting, and just a lot of melodrama. And I didn't care about any of the characters in here. The characters were all just assholes that are basically just arguing the entire book, and I just was bored out of my mind. I didn't care about anything that was happening, and yeah, I just decided to put this down. So I apologize if you're a fan of this book. I could not get into it. I didn't want to force myself to keep reading it. So yeah, that was my one DNF this month, and I think this is only like the second or third DNF that I've had this year. So yeah, I don't do that too often, but this is one I just could not get into. That's Wuthering Heights. Okay, alright. Getting into the rest of the books that I did read this month. Again, going in the order that I read them. The very first book that I read this month is The October Country by Ray Bradbury. And I believe this is his very first collection of short stories, and this is also my first time reading one of his short story collections. I have read a few of his short stories previously in like different like anthology books and such. But this is my first time actually sitting down and reading one of his short story collections. And let's see, I gave this book a 3.5 out of 5 stars overall. And I had a pretty good time reading through this. His style of writing has really grown on me. And I think his style lends itself better to like the short format, the short story type of storytelling versus novel. Where the purple prose and like poetic style writing is kind of toned down a little bit. Some of his novels are just a bit wordy and have some of that like flowery prose to them that can sometimes be a little bit of a hindrance to the reading experience, in my opinion. But I really do like his style of storytelling within this short format. And like most short story collections, not everything in here was good. There were some good stories. There were some bad ones. Some of my favorites in here were, if I can find the contents, The Wind. I really enjoyed that one. It's basically about this guy who has a friend that lives off somewhere like out in the hills, kind of isolated. And his friend, I think, if I'm remembering correctly, that he was like a war veteran or something. And his friend calls him on the phone like on a daily basis and is going on these ramblings. And he's kind of this paranoid character, and he thinks that there's something spooky about the wind. He thinks that the wind may be trying to like blow his house down or knock his house down and get to him and kill him, and he says he's hearing voices in the wind and things like that. And his friend feels kind of bad for this guy. He feels some sympathy for him, and he wants to help him, but he also thinks he's a bit cuckoo and you know, kind of losing his marbles. And his wife, not the guy's wife that's like paranoid, but the friend that's receiving the phone calls, his wife is basically telling him, like, your friend is crazy, you need to just ignore him, he's losing his mind, you know, don't worry about him. And the guy continues to call him throughout, and he says he wants to come visit him, and he never does. And then eventually, all of the stories in here, by the way, have like twist endings. And eventually, there might turn out to be something with the wind after all. This guy's fears and paranoia about these vicious winds that are blowing against his house might have some grounds to them after all. He might have good reason to be scared of this, yeah. I really enjoyed this story. It has kind of a weird idea, sort of a strange premise, but there was something about it. It was just very creepy, a very haunting story. I really liked it. It was very well written. Probably the best kind of story, or best version of that idea you're ever going to see. If there's anything else out there like that, I'm not sure, but yeah, I really enjoyed The Wind. Another one in here that I really liked is called The Emissary. It's basically about this young boy. I think he's like 12 years old or so, and he's disabled, and he's pretty much stuck in bed all day. And the story takes place during like autumn, fall. I think Halloween is approaching, and the boy is just very down in the dumps because of his disability and the fact that he's stuck in bed. This is his favorite time of the year, and unfortunately he can't go anywhere. It doesn't really go into a lot of detail about what his disability is exactly, but yeah, he's stuck in bed. He also has this pet dog that he basically sends out and like runs around outside and runs through the leaves and travels around, and then the dog comes back to visit the boy. And this dog is like very loyal and faithful to this kid. And this kid basically picks up the scents on his dog. The dog comes to visit him after running around outside, and the kid will like pick up the scents of like fall and autumn, and will imagine himself being out there and is kind of like living vicariously through his pet dog. And this story is like kind of sad and has like some emotion to it. You feel kind of bad for this kid. And one day, the dog doesn't come back. He sends the dog out, the dog runs around, and the dog just never shows up again. And then we get a little bit of a twist at the end of the story where the dog may or may not return, and he may or may not bring something with him. It's hard to talk about these without spoiling. I don't want to give anything away, but yeah, I really enjoyed this story as well. This was a pretty good one. And this one also did have some of those fall and autumn vibes to it, which I really liked. Speaking of which, this book being titled The October Country, I was expecting a lot of the stories in here to be centered kind of around that, Halloween, things like that. Unfortunately, most of the stories aren't, but there are a few stories in here that do have that kind of Halloween vibe to them. Speaking of which, another one of my favorites in here is called Homecoming. And that one probably has the most Halloween vibes to it out of the stories in here. And that one is basically about this kid who is an outcast, sort of the black sheep of his family. His family is having this huge like family reunion get-together thing. However, this is not a normal family. This is basically a family of monsters. You have all of these different people that are like witches and different monsters and creatures having this giant reunion. And this kid is the only one in the family that is not a monster, that doesn't have any sort of like powers. He's not undead. He's just like a normal kid, and he feels left out. He feels like an outcast. He's very saddened by this. Meanwhile, all of his family members are like vampires and different types of monsters. And this one also is kind of like an emotional type story a little bit. But I just loved it so much. Homecoming was a great story. Definitely one of my favorites in here. There are quite a few stories in here too that I did not care for as much. There's The Lake. I wasn't a big fan of that one. There's a story in here called The Watchful Poker Chip of H. Mattis. I don't even remember much about that one. I know I didn't really like it. So yeah, like most short story collections, kind of a mixed bag. I gave the book 3.5 out of 5 stars overall. There were some pretty good stories in here. I enjoyed reading through this, and I look forward to reading more by Ray Bradbury in the future. That's The October Country. Okay, the next books that I read this month, I'm not going to be talking about these ones too much. These are some Goosebumps Horrorland books. I did a ranking of the entire Goosebumps Horrorland series. If you want to go back and watch that video, hear my thoughts on these. I'm not going to talk about them too much here, but I will just say, Slappy New Year, I did not enjoy this at all. And The Horror at Chiller House, this one was pretty decent. Let's see, I gave Slappy New Year a 1.75, in the Horror at Chiller House a 2.25. So yeah, they were just, this one was just okay, decent, I guess. Slappy New Year sucked. This one's a complete rehash of like the first 3 Night of the Living Dummy books from the original series. So yeah, I read those 2 this month. Go watch my Horrorland ranking if you want to see more thoughts on that series as a whole on these books. Okay, the next book I read this month is the next book in the series of Unfortunate Events. Book number 5, The Auster Academy. And I enjoyed this one quite a bit. Let's see, what did I give it? A 2.75 out of 5. It was decent. I think I enjoyed it slightly more than the last one, The Miserable Mill, which I was not a big fan of. It was okay, but the setting was just super dull. It was just kind of a bland book where they're in a lumber mill just the entire book. And this one, they're basically in this giant school academy. This one had a little bit more interesting stuff to it, I guess. Definitely not one of my favorite books either, though. I'm 5 books deep in the series now. And I'll be honest, I'm already starting to lose a little bit of interest. But I will continue on with this series. I want to reread through all of them. I read through these books many, many years ago when I was a kid. And I remember liking the series, but I don't really remember a lot about most of the books, like, specifically. So yeah, I'm curious to go through, continue through this series. This one was just decent. Again, it's like a 2.75. Yeah, that's the Auster Academy. I don't have much to say about that one. Okay, the next book I read this month is a Mysterious book. This is Escape from Grimstone Manor, and this is like a modern day kids horror series. And this is the very first book in the series. And I'll be honest, I was a little bit disappointed with this. I was expecting to love this book because this book has elements of like dark fantasy to it. It's like an action adventure, dark fantasy like kids book. You basically have these kids going to this theme park, and there's this giant like haunted house thing called Grimstone Manor. And there's this old legend revolving around this manor of this like necromancer. And this necromancer comes to life and brings all of these like skeletons and different creatures to life. And there's this werewolf. And these kids are basically like fighting these different monsters and trying to figure out how to defeat the necromancer and escape from this haunted house. And it sounds awesome, right? Like on paper, that just sounds like an absolute blast to read. Unfortunately, I just could not get into this for some reason. I'm not sure if it's the writing. I know the characters. I didn't really care about any of the characters. I felt like they weren't very well written. I don't know. There was just something about this. I hate to say it, but there was just something about it that I could not get into at all. This is one of those books I didn't feel immersed in. I feel like maybe we didn't get enough description of the setting. It just felt kind of bland. I don't know. It it sounds awesome on paper. I love the premise. You know, I like dark fantasy, and I read a lot of kids horror books like this, so I feel like this, in theory, should have been up my alley, but it just wasn't. Let's see, I gave Escape from Grimstone Manor a 2.25 out of 5. I didn't hate it, didn't think it was outright bad or anything like that. It just wasn't really for me. I might try reading another one of the Mysterious books, but yeah, this one was just kind of okay, I guess. So yeah. Let's see, the next book I read this month is Women in Trouble by Regina St. Clair. I have read a couple of her books already. This is the 3rd book that I read by her. And I believe this is one that came out right before Code Red, which is my favorite book by Regina. And this one is a short story collection. And it opens up with a novella in here called Snowblind. It's about like, let me see, about like 80 pages long, roughly. And that was one of my favorite short stories in here. Or no, it's a novella, I guess. But one of my favorite stories in here. And it's basically about this couple. The husband is a real, like, just sleazeball character. He's like one of those over-the-top asshole, like, jerk characters who, like, openly cheats on his wife and is very, like, abusive and just not a good character at all. It's kind of, like, over-the-top, and he's, like, obviously a jerk. And he's plotting to, like, kill his wife. Him, his wife, and then the wife's, one of her friends is going on like this getaway in this cabin in this middle of winter, like up in the wilderness somewhere. I don't remember where exactly. And he's plotting to like have her killed or assassinated or something like that. And his wife and her friend catch wind of the plan, and they devise their own plan to kill her husband off. And while they're up in the wilderness, there also may be some kind of creature lurking in the woods, waiting to get them all. So yeah, this was a really fun story. I really enjoyed Snowblind for the most part. There was a little bit of a twist that I didn't care for in the story. With a certain character, with like plotting even another like plot to kind of like backhand the wife, one of her relatives, in cohorts with her husband. And I just, yeah, I didn't really care for that twist. It didn't feel believable to me. I didn't really like the way things exactly ended up going with that one. But I did enjoy Snowblind, I think, probably the most out of all the stories in here. The rest of the stories in here, I don't know. This is one that I wasn't really feeling either, to be honest. It was decent. It was okay. I didn't hate this book or anything. I gave it, let me see. Let me get 2.5. Yeah, 2.5 out of 5 stars. Let me kind of look at the contents real quick here. See, some of these short stories, just the subject matter and the content of them wasn't really my cup of tea, I don't think. It just didn't really appeal to me. But they were fairly well written. I do like Regina St. Clair's writing style, and I will probably continue to check out her work in the future, or any new books that she comes out with. But yeah, a lot of the stories in here just weren't my cup of tea. There were some pretty disturbing stories in here, I will admit. There was one story in here that deals with like the Hollywood elite and them basically doing things to maintain their youth. That story was very disturbing. However, I didn't really enjoy it necessarily. I think maybe because it felt too true to life. I think it's something that probably might actually happen out there in real life. Who knows? If you've read that story, you know what I'm talking about. I don't even feel comfortable talking about it on camera. It's pretty messed up. But yeah, overall, 2.5 out of 5 stars. I enjoyed a couple of the stories in here. Again, Snowblind was probably my favorite. And yeah, it was just okay overall. Okay, the next book that I read this month is Wounds by Nathan Ballingrud. And this book was actually recommended to me by my good friend BD Horror, aka the Horrorlander. Go check out his YouTube channel. He has a great channel where he also reviews kids' horror books, adult horror books, horror movies, pretty much anything relating to horror. And he did a review of this, and I'm pretty sure this is like one of his favorite adult horror books that he's ever read. And he recommended it to me. And this is a collection of 6 short stories, and I think like 2 novellas. 2 of them are novellas, and then the rest are short stories. And this book is basically like dark fantasy with elements of horror to it. I wouldn't say it's necessarily straight up horror, although there is one story in here, which is my favorite story, and it is called The Visible Filth. And that story was terrifying. That story actually creeped me out, and apparently was also turned into a movie titled Wounds, but I heard that movie wasn't very good. I think it came out a few years ago, like 2019 or 2020, around there, and it didn't look like it had good ratings. It was very successful, but the story was fantastic. Some of the other stories in here, you have, let me look at the contents again, because I'm already forgetting the names of them. The Atlas of Hell, The Diabolist, Skull Pocket, The Maw, The Visible Filth, and The Butcher's Table. The Diabolist, that is also one of my favorite stories in here. I think that's my second favorite behind The Visible Filth. The Diabolist, that story has such strong emotion to it, and that story got to me. It's basically about this guy whose wife dies, and he's really struggling with like the grief of that and just trying to deal with that. And in his grief, he turns to like black magic and the dark arts kind of, and he has this book, and he starts doing these dark arts kind of things in his cellar or in his basement, trying to basically like bring back his wife to see if there's some kind of way he can resurrect her or contact her spirit or something of the sort. And what ends up happening is he ends up resurrecting this demonic like creature by mistake instead of his wife. I believe it's called an imp in the story, but it's basically a demon. And then this guy, the husband and father, passes away, and his daughter takes over. And basically, in her grief of losing both of her parents, she also kind of turns to this black magic and dark arts as like a way of coping and trying to like resolve things. And of course, you should never mess with that kind of stuff, there's never going to be a good outcome when you start getting into that. And this story was it was really good. I enjoyed The Diabolist. It's kind of sad. It had some good emotion to it, like I said. It was also pretty dark and had some disturbing stuff to it. And a pretty crazy, like, final act and twist ending. And this is one of the shorter stories in here. But I really enjoyed The Diabolist. So yeah, The Diabolist and The Visible Field, those two stories were really good. I enjoyed both of those quite a bit. The rest of the stories in here were just kind of okay. I didn't exactly love this book. I didn't like it as much as my friend BD Horror did. I gave it a flat 3 out of 5 overall, but it was good, and I'm glad he recommended this to me. And I would maybe recommend checking this out if it sounds like something that's up your alley. Again, I don't think this is straight up horror. It feels more like a dark fantasy book. It's got a lot of lore to it, with like the idea of hell and all of these different creatures and demons, but it's a very like fictionalized, like fantastical version of that. It doesn't feel like it's trying to be realistic or trying to go for, you know, just scares and like your typical horror elements and things like that. It feels like more of a fantasy version of that. But yeah, pretty decent book overall. That's Wounds. Okay, the next book I read this month is Goodnight Kiss 2. And I uploaded a short on YouTube. I did for this just like a short review. And I liked the first book in the series. I thought the first one was pretty decent. The sequel, not so much. This book I gave a flat 2 out of 5 stars. This is one of the worst super chillers I've read so far. This is part of the super chiller series. And yeah, this book was such a letdown. This one, it's kind of just a rehash of the first book. It goes through like the same structure, same plot line of the first one. And the characters in here are so dumb. My main drawback with the story is how idiotic the characters are in this book. Primarily the main character. Literally the entire book, our main character believes in these vampires. I can't remember if he's a recurring character from the first book. It's been a little while since I've read it. But he believes in these vampires. He sees their existence. And he's basically trying to convince his friends that these vampires are real. He's trying to warn them, trying to get them to help him, like, defeat these vampires. And he even says in the book, I can't remember if it's like through dialogue or inner monologue, but I do remember the main character thinking or saying at some point that he's got to do something about these vampires. He's got to defeat them. He has to be the one to stop them. But what does he do in this entire book? He does nothing about it except try to convince his friends and family that the vampires are real. That's it. And of course, they don't believe him. Why should they believe him? It's just so mind-numbingly idiotic. Oh my god, this book it drove me batty. Pun intended. There's actually one scene in here too, where I think a couple of characters witness these black bats fly down. They're on the beach. These bats fly down, pick up this dog, and fly away. And they think it's no big deal. They just think, oh, these bats just carried off a dog. They're just regular bats. Why would they be vampires? I'm just like, oh my god. This book is so idiotic. It's not quite the worst Fear Street book that I've read. I've read some other YA titles by R.L. Stein that are unfortunately worse than this one. But this was not good. Yeah. Flat 2 out of 5 stars for Goodnight Kiss 2. I don't really have much positive to say about this one. So yeah. Okay. The next book I read this month is The Trap Door. This is part of the Screamer series. And this is a very obscure kids' horror series. Actually, I don't even know if it's proper to call it a series. There's only 2 books in it. And this is a collection of short stories. And this collection of short stories, I feel like a lot of the stories in here are very reminiscent of like Twilight Zone stories or episodes. There's one that even takes place with like the army or the military. They're going to investigate like this crash site somewhere where this helicopter like crashed into the jungle or forest floor or something. And then it turns out there's a twist where they're like viewing themselves in the past or something, and there's like this time travel aspect. I don't know. I don't even remember the fine details. I'll be honest, I was not a big fan of this book. Some of the stories in here, though, are just straight rip-offs of Twilight Zone episodes. I think the very first story in here is one, as a matter of fact. Yes, The Shapeshifter. The Shapeshifter is the very first short story in here, and it is literally a rip-off of It's a Good Life from the Twilight Zone, which happens to be one of the best and probably my personal favorite episode from the original Twilight Zone show. to where you have this very young child who is basically like omniscient and omnipotent, has these powers. In this story specifically, he has like some kind of gem or something that's granting him these powers, and he does whatever he wants. And he's holding his sister and their grandmother, I believe they live with in the story. He's basically like holding them hostage and turning them into his playthings and like doing whatever he wants with them, ordering and bossing them around, creating these creatures. He's basically just all powerful and does whatever he wants. And his sister and his grandmother are like at his mercy, basically. And yeah, it's literally a straight up ripoff of It's a Good Life. So yeah, and there's other stories in here that are they just feel like Twilight Zone ripoffs, honestly, like kids' story versions of them. So yeah, I was not a big fan of this book. I gave it a 2.25 out of 5. If I ever find the other book in the series, I do not have it in my collection. I believe it's called The Fright Mask. It looks like a Haunted Mask ripoff from Goosebumps. If I ever find it, I might add it to my collection for just the heck of it, but yeah. This book was just kind of whatever to me. Not terrible, but not really all that great either. Let me look at the content section real quick, because I feel like there was a couple stories in here that I enjoyed. I just can't remember them. Oh yes, Piece by Piece. That was a story in here that I actually thought was kind of cool. Basically about this surgeon, I think, or some kind of doctor who's gone like mental over the death of his like 15-year-old kid. And the kid's organs were all donated and then used by various people after his death. And this guy, the father of this 15-year-old kid, goes crazy and is going around and like killing all of the people that had like their organs implanted from his son, and trying to like get all of them back so he can like, I don't know, try to build his dead son back together, I guess, or collect his pieces. I don't know. It's kind of messed up. I kind of enjoyed that story, and it did feel very familiar reading it. I'm pretty sure I've read something similar in some kind of old like folktale or campfire type story, some kind of short story collection. So I don't think it's entirely original, but I did enjoy that story. I like the idea of it. It's kind of messed up. So yeah, Piece by Piece, that was probably my favorite story in here. I feel like there may have been one or two others that I kind of liked, but I've already forgotten most of this book, and I didn't really think it was all that great. So yeah, that's the Trapdoor, part of the Screamers series by Don Wolfson. Definitely the author's real name, Don Wolfson. Okay, let's see. The next book that I read this month is book number 9 in the Martian Tale series by Edgar Rice Burroughs. That is Synthetic Men of Mars. And I'll just say right up front that I was not a big fan of this one. I gave this book a 2 out of 5 stars. I think this is probably my least favorite Martian Tales book that I've read so far. And that's saying something, because there's been a couple other books in the series I didn't really enjoy all that much. But I think this one takes the cake for potentially being the worst. And the thing about this book, why I didn't like it, it actually opens up with kind of an interesting premise. You have this Red Martian man, this new side character introduced, who is working alongside John Carter, which is kind of weird to me. Why wouldn't they just make the main character of this entire series, why wouldn't they, again, continue it from his point of view? It seems like the best books are the ones where John Carter is narrating or leading the story, but instead they choose to have the character told from the point of view of one of like John Carter's like assistants or sidekicks, basically. And they're going out on this mission to find Ross Davis, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, who is like the mastermind of Mars. He was a recurring character. He was in like book number 6 of the series. And he's basically like this mad scientist, and he is supposedly like one of the smartest guys on all of Barsoom. And he does all these crazy experiments and such. And John Carter is trying to find him to help save his princess and wife, Deja Thoris, who has some kind of like illness or something, or brain disease. And he has to find Ross Davis to be able to help her and save her. However, after that opening and kind of introduction to that plot line, it is pretty much completely abandoned, like almost immediately. They go out on this mission to find him. Of course, they get captured by this new undiscovered race of Martians in like this swamp. This one takes place in like a swamp marsh type setting, which is kind of cool, but we don't really get much description or atmosphere of that type of setting. And then from there, John Carter manages to escape and kind of just vanishes for the rest of the story. And we're left following this side character that I can't even remember his name, honestly. And pretty much he falls in love with this other girl that's captured by these evil Barsoomians, and he is trying to rescue her and trying to escape himself. And there are these synthetic Martians, as per the title that you would see here on the cover. I think they're known as Hormads, I believe they're called, and there's these artificial creatures that are built as like an army to try to like take over the planet. And yeah, pretty much the entire story, we're following this Red Man of Helium, John Carter's sidekick, as he's captured. He immediately falls in love. There's like an insta love in every one of these books almost. Falls in love with this girl he's never even met. Tries to rescue her from this place, and they escape. And I just did not like this one. And again, it's just super formulaic. They introduced this main plot, which sounds like it could be good, and then they completely abandon this main plot. John Carter doesn't come back until like the very end of the book. Deja Thoris is not even mentioned like throughout the whole story. And yeah, this one was just such a flop in my opinion. I did not like this one at all. It's not completely terrible. I wouldn't say I outright hated any of these books, but this one comes kind of close. I did not like this one. It gets a flat 2 out of 5 stars. Yeah, that's Synthetic Men of Mars. Book number 9 in the Martian Tales. Okay, the next book I read this month is something a little bit different. And that is Plants vs. Zombies, Lawn of Doom. This is a graphic novel. And I found this for super cheap at like a local used book sale. It was like 50 cents. Everything there was 50 cents. And I saw this and thought, why not? Sure, I'll give this a shot. Looks like it could just be a quick, fun read. And I actually played like the original Plants vs. Zombies video game many, many years ago, back when it was like new and big and popular. I think it had like just come out. Yeah, I was kind of curious about this, and it was okay, I guess. I gave it a 2.5 out of 5 stars. It was kind of a quick, fun read, but it was also kind of dumb and I think a little bit too childish for my taste. It's not something I'll be seeking out more of in this series. Apparently, there's a lot of different graphic novels and comics in this series. It's been going on for a little while, and this one is like I looked it up. This one's like number 9 or 10, I think. There's quite a few of these. I think there's like 20 or more. So yeah, I don't think I'll be seeking out more of these, but it was just kind of a quick, fun read. It was alright, so yeah. Not much to say about that. Plants vs. Zombies. Okay. The next book I read this month is a Fear Street book, and that is Cheerleaders, the First Evil. And let's see. I gave this one a 3.25 out of 5. I thought this book was pretty good. I enjoyed it for the most part. You basically have this cheerleading squad, and bad things start to happen, and there may or may not be an evil spirit possessing one of the girls and forcing them to do bad things to one another. There's some injuries, some deaths in this book, and yeah, I thought this was a pretty good book. I've seen a lot of people say that this is like one of the best Fear Street books, and it's like amazing. Apparently this is like a trilogy, and there's also a couple of sequels in the Super Chiller series, which I have not yet read those. And I can see that. I can see why some people might love this. It was a little bit of a slow burn, and there is a lot of like teen melodrama in here, which is kind of par for the course for these. I've come to expect that at this point. This one felt like it had a little bit more than usual in the first half. The first like 60 to 70 pages of this book is pretty uneventful, and it's just a lot of teen drama and arguing, and not really much else happening within the first half. So yeah, I didn't quite love it. I didn't think it was quite as good as everyone makes it out to be, but it was pretty decent. Like a 3.25 out of 5. Fairly solid book. Okay, and then the next book I read this month is Cheerleaders, the Second Evil. So yes, I actually read the trilogy this month. This one wasn't quite as good. I gave it, let me see. I gave this one a 2.75 out of 5. The first one was definitely quite a bit better. Yeah, this one, it was still decent. It was okay. It was not as good as the first one, so yeah. That's all I have to say for that, I guess. I'm trying to keep things somewhat brief here, because I've already been filming for a little while, and I don't want my phone to stop recording and run out of camera space, or phone storage. So yeah. Alright, moving on. I read the final book in the Henry Huggins series by Beverly Cleary, and that is Ribby. And I enjoyed this book quite a bit. I gave this one a 3.25 out of 5. This one, of course, we are following Ribby throughout the majority of this book and his different shenanigans he gets into. He ends up running away and gets lost, and he's taken in by some different families, and he's trying to figure out how to get back to Henry Huggins. And this is basically just a cute, charming, like, dog story. and I enjoyed it. I'm a bit of a dog person myself, so I always enjoy reading animal stories, and I enjoyed this one. I think it was a good story to end on the Henry Huggins series, and yeah, this was a pretty good book. I liked Ribby. Okay, the next book I read this month is The Tent by Keelan Patrick Burke. This is a novella, very, very short. I think it's only like 60 pages. Yeah, about 60 pages long. And I've read quite a few books by Keelan Patrick Burke at this point. And I keep reading stuff by this author in hopes I'm going to find something as epic as the book Kin was, which was one that I read earlier this year. I think it was like back in January or February, I can't remember. And I absolutely love that book. It is one of my all-time favorite horror books that I've ever read. Unfortunately, I have not found anything that comes close to that. And this one was just kind of okay. I gave it like a 2.75 out of 5. And part of what led me to read this is this book takes place in Hocking Hills, Ohio. And I was actually in Hocking Hills very recently for like a vacation and getaway. For those of you who aren't familiar with the area, it's a very like wilderness type area. A bit of a tourist, like popular tourist spot because there's a lot of hiking trails, a lot of like cliffs and caves and different things you can explore. It's a pretty cool area. And I figured I would read this since I was just recently there on vacation. And unfortunately, I feel like this book the story did not utilize that setting well. We didn't really get much description or setting of the woods. I felt like there was even if I wouldn't have known this book takes place in Hocking Hills, I wouldn't have guessed it by reading the story. And the story itself, it was okay, I guess, but it really wasn't what I was expecting. I was expecting something a little bit creepier, and instead this feels like kind of a B-movie action, like creature feature type story. The tent in question happens to be kind of the monster in a way. I don't know if I want to spoil the story or not. But yeah, there's like a weird monster in this book that ends up attacking the various characters in here. And I don't know. It was okay, I guess. Like a 2.75 out of 5. I don't have much to say about this one. It wasn't bad, but it wasn't really all that great either, in my opinion. And I have discovered that I think I like Keelan Patrick Burke's writing better in novel form rather than in short form. I've read some of his short stories as well as, quite a few of his novellas at this point. And I wish he would write more novels. It doesn't seem like he has many full-length novels. It seems like most of his work is shorter work like this. But yeah, I want to check out more of his novels because a lot of his shorter stuff like this has just been kind of okay for me. So yeah, that's The Tent by Keelan Patrick Burke. Okay, the next book I read this month is Cheerleaders, The Third Evil. And I gave this one a flat 3 out of 5 stars. So how I would rank this Cheerleaders trilogy is the first book is my favorite, then this one, and then the second one last. So this one, again, kind of decent, okay, not quite as good as the first book. But I like this one because this one has some pretty dark and intense stuff to it. With the other two books, basically the main characters are trying to figure out who the evil spirit is like possessing. I guess like minor spoiler alert, I am kind of like giving things away a little bit, but the first two books involve like them trying to figure out who this evil spirit is possessing. And in this one, the main character herself, again, spoiler alert, Corky, she is the one battling this evil spirit. It is like trying to take over her body, and she's trying to fight it. And she's unwillingly like doing these bad things to her friends. And I kind of like that. I kind of like how it changes things up a little bit. And again, there's some pretty intense and dark stuff in here, some violent things that happen. But there's also some pretty cringy moments too regarding this evil spirit, and also some kind of weird logic in how it operates and sort of the rules and how it's defeated and how it keeps coming back again. It doesn't completely make sense. And some of the dialogue, it's just, I don't know. It was kind of cringy, but it was still a solid read. Like a flat 3 out of 5 stars. Again, none of these Cheerleaders books I loved will be among my favorite, but overall, I enjoyed reading through this trilogy. Now I just need to read the 2 sequels in the Super Chiller series. So yeah, this Cheerleaders, The Third Evil. Okay, the next book I read this month is The Lost Village by Camilla Sten. And I believe the author is Polish. This book is translated by Alexandra Fleming. And it takes place in Sweden, I believe. And in this book, we basically follow this crew of filmmakers that are aiming to like film this documentary about this ghost town in Sweden. It's like out in the wilderness, middle of nowhere. And there's this legend surrounding this ghost town where all of these people that lived in this ghost town like decades ago just magically disappeared one day without a trace. No one's ever been able to solve this mystery or figure out what happened to the townsfolk. And these people are basically trying to figure out what happened. They're like kind of shooting a documentary about this town and trying to uncover this mystery. And while they're in this town, they encounter some supernatural occurrences. Some weird things start to happen. You know, is there ghosts in this town? Is there maybe some stragglers, people still alive from this town from decades ago? Some weird things start to happen. Maybe some of the members and their own crew start going a bit crazy. So yeah, The Village by Camilla Sten. I gave this book a flat 3 out of 5 stars. I thought it was decent. I enjoyed it, but it wasn't anything great or anything I'd go out of my way to recommend, to be honest. And this is a newer-ish book. I think it came out, like, let me see if I can find when the release date of this was. This edition came out in 2022, but I think the book came out before that, 2019. So yeah, this is still a fairly new book. It came out only like 4 or 5 years ago now. And there were some creepy moments in here. I liked some of the supernatural stuff. There were some very creepy scenes. There's a scene where the main character is in one of the vans. They have these big vans they rented to store all like their camera equipment and everything. And she's in the van by herself. And I think it's like thunderstorming outside or raining or something. And she hears footsteps outside of her van. And then the footsteps just stop. And she thinks it's, you know, one of her friends, one of the crew members. And she looks outside of like the windshield of the van and sees one of the members she suspects that's standing beside her van, and they're like standing far away, like somewhere else. I think by like one of the other vans or whatever. And she realizes the other people that are part of her group are like off doing something else. And she like stops. She's sitting there in the van. She clearly heard these footsteps and then just nothing. And she realizes that no one in her group could possibly be standing outside of her van. And once she comes to that realization, she starts like freaking out and panicking. That was kind of a creepy scene, very well written. So yeah, there's some different like supernatural occurrences and weird things that happen like that, as I've already mentioned. I know I'm kind of repeating myself here, but overall, I didn't love this book. I think the characters is one of the reasons why. None of the characters in here are likable. They're also not well written. They feel kind of one-dimensional. The main character especially is kind of a jerk. She's literally just doing this documentary for her own self-gain pretty much at the expense of her friends. One of her friends injures herself pretty badly. And instead of like leaving this town to go get her help, to get her out of this situation, take her to the hospital, she talks her into staying basically. Like, oh, it's not that bad. It's just a sprained ankle. You'll be okay. We really need to shoot this documentary. We really need the money. So yeah, the main character, she's kind of a jerk. I did not like her at all. Really, there was only one character in this book that I like kind of somewhat liked, and she ends up dying. So yeah, characters I didn't really care about. And I also did not like the denouement of this book, the final act. The big twist about what happens and why these people disappeared is kind of disturbing, kind of creepy, but sort of the reason behind it. And then the one thing that's kind of like haunting the crew members, I did not like that twist at all. It felt kind of cheesy. It removed... Okay, so apparently my phone ran out of storage space and it stopped recording while I was talking about the last 2 books. Thankfully, I only had a couple books left to go, but still, I was pretty much just talking into nothingness for a while, my phone not recording anything. So yeah, it's a little bit frustrating. I just got done doing like a 10-minute review, full review on like this next book I'm talking about, which is Stein Ting 3, and I'm kind of lazy and I don't feel like going into great detail about this all over again after having just talked into nothing about this book. But yeah, I'll kind of go over this again a little bit. So this is the second to the last book I read this month, Stein Ting 3. This just came out. I read this over the course of a couple days. And I will say that I love the artwork on this. This has my favorite cover art out of all 3 Stein Ting books by a landslide. Unfortunately, out of the 3 Stein Ting books, this one is my least favorite in terms of the content. There was not a single story in here that I loved. Most of the stories are just kind of okay, whatever to me. A few decent ones that I gave like 3 out of 5 stars to. A couple of bad ones that I gave like 2 or less. My least favorite story in here I gave a 1.5 out of 5 stars to. It was downright bad. It's called Eddie the Flash, and it's a superhero, like comic book type story. R.L. Stein likes writing about that kind of thing occasionally in that subgenre. It also deals with like meta stuff, like meta humor and like a meta twist to it. And I don't like that either. So R.L. Stein takes 2 stereotypes, like subgenres that I don't like, puts them together in like a super predictable Dr. Maniac feeling type story. And of course I'm going to end up hating it. I did not like that one at all. There were a couple stories in here I liked. I think one of my favorites was one called The Magic is in the Hat, which is like a story dealing with like magicians and like magic and stuff. And that one, it wasn't great, but I thought it was okay, decent. It had some good humor and charm to it. It wasn't really scary, but it was just like kind of more of a funny, charming story. I like that one. And then one of the other stories in here that I liked, is called The Bad Luck King. And that one deals with like superstition and stuff, and I do tend to like that little like subgenre. I like stories about superstition and that kind of stuff. I don't know why, that's just something that appeals to me. And I also liked it because it felt a little bit more unique. It didn't feel like a complete ripoff of other stuff he's already done. Speaking of which, the majority of this book sadly is. As someone who is a long-time R.L. Stein fan and who has read the majority of his work at this point, I've read so many R.L. Stein books outside of Goosebumps even. And most of the stories in here are just ideas that he's already done before. Everything in here is super predictable. And I think that's part of the reason I didn't end up enjoying it. I don't think this book is necessarily bad. It's just, it feels all like stuff that I've already read by R.L. Stein. So yeah, overall I gave this book a 2.5 out of 5 stars. It was okay. My least favorite of these Stein Tinglers books, not quite terrible. It's just super predictable. And there wasn't any story in here that I loved, sadly, while the first 2 books had a couple stories, at least in each of those, that I thought were pretty good. So yeah, this was the second to the last book I read this month. Someone who's not as exposed to R.L. Stein's work might get some more enjoyment out of this than me. I don't want to dissuade you from checking this book out. It's just, yeah, feels like stories that I've already read before by R.L. Stein. There's nothing in here that's super unique to him. So yeah, that's Stein Tinglers 3. And then the very last book that I read this month is Back to School, part of the Bone Chiller series. And I've read a few Bone Chillers books now, and this one is just kind of okay, decent. I gave it a 2.75 out of 5. And I will say that I actually think I like the episode adaptation more than this. There is a Bone Chillers TV show. For those of you who aren't aware, it only lasted for 1 season, I think 13 episodes. And most of the episodes are adaptations of the books. But there's a couple episodes I think that were exclusive to the show, if I remember correctly. And yeah, the episode I think just is a lot more fun and entertaining. The book just feels a little bit bland, but I think it's still okay. I do kind of like the plot to this one, to where you basically have this new lunch lady at school, and she's kind of mysterious and creepy, and she's basically half fly, half human, and she may or may not be putting bugs and insects in the children's lunches, which might be doing something to the kids and turning them into something, kind of. There's some really creepy body horror in the story that I really like, and also some goofy humor and funny moments as well. This is a good comedy horror book, and I just think the episode is a better execution of this idea and takes some more creative liberties. There are some differences between this and the episode, and I think the episode is just a little bit better overall, but the book was still okay, a 2.75 out of 5. That's Back to School, part of the Bone Chiller series. Yeah, that's the last book I read this month. Alright, that is everything that I read in the month of August. As usual, feel free to let me know down in the comments if you've read any of these books, if you have any thoughts you want to share. Anything, feel free to post down below. That is all I have for today, guys. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.